Welcome.
Okay, while I'm just getting set up here, I do have slides tonight, and you can ask Father for, I know that not everyone's going to be able to read the slides. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? No? Hello? Hello? Maybe, if you could turn it up a bit. I'm not known for my loud voice. I've already learned that. Okay, so I do have slides tonight and tomorrow, and I recognize not everybody's going to be able to read the fonts and all of that. So everything that's on the slide I'll be reading, making sure you guys know what's there. But if you're curious to see the slides, because there's some quotes maybe you want to hear again, I did give the links to Father, so you can just use the links, just get the link from him, and you should have access to the slides. So I thought over the course of this weekend we could talk a bit about redeeming time during Lent. And I'm going to start today with some questions. Have you ever found it difficult to pray or reach out to Christ due to, here I have a few options, due to the memory of past regrets or failures, due to anxiety about how a current situation will affect the future, due to dissatisfaction or boredom with your present circumstances? Have you found it difficult to pray or reach out to Christ due to preoccupation with what you hope to accomplish in the future? Have you ever found it difficult to reach out to Christ due to anger or resentment towards someone who has wronged you? Now, if you answered yes for any of those, and I would guess that all of us answered yes for all of them, and if you haven't, I'd like to meet you, learn your secret. But the point is, if you've answered yes for any of those, I would suggest that maybe it's time to start thinking about redeeming time. Where am I getting this phrase from, redeeming time? St. Paul, in several of his epistles in the New Testament, uses this phrase. And here I'm using the instance that's most famous. It's coming from Ephesians 5:15 through 16. He tells the Ephesians, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil." And we often hear this verse. First of all, it's not a verse that comes up very often, which is interesting to me because personally it's one I think about a lot. As Father mentioned, I work a lot on the topic of time. Most of all of my writing, my podcasting, my research, I'm always thinking about how time connects with our faith as Orthodox Christians. And this verse is really interesting to me because it tells me at least, that we kind of have some agency in the way that we act within time, in the way that we perceive time, in what we make of our time in this life. He says, redeem the time because the days are evil. Now, there's a lot we could talk about. What does it mean the days are evil? What does this word redeem really mean? The actual Greek verb for this word, redeem, means to buy back. So if you think of the Jubilee years in the Old Testament, when you could buy back a field that maybe your family had lost in the previous 50 years. During the Jubilee year, you could earn that field back and get it back in your family's name. Or you could buy back a slave out of slavery. That is what redeem means. Or offer someone mercy on their loan. This is kind of the same idea. And what we're doing is we're buying back our days from the abyss of death, from the abyss of emptiness that comes with sin. So it's a really interesting thought. But I think that when we hear this verse, we tend to limit it to maybe the present or the future. We think, okay, we're in the present, so whatever has happened in the past, from this point forward, we're kind of redeeming the time that's given to us, right? But if you think about time in the traditional sense, and here I'm not just talking about the traditional Christian philosophy of time, but even going back to the ancients, like Plato, time was always thought to consist of 3 distinct parts: past, present, and future. Time was kind of this harmony of what has come before and what's going to come in the future, and then this kind of razor-thin edge of the present. So you could never talk about time as just one of these 3. It was always kind of this harmony, this mysterious harmony or blending of all 3 elements. And I think too that through Christ, when it comes to redeeming the time, because Christ has trampled down death, he's kind of in a way trampled down the divisions that we as humans tend to enact with regard to the past and the future. And that's very abstract. I'll explain a bit more what I mean. But suffice it to say for now, back to this verse, redeeming the time, I think that as Christians, we can actually work towards redeeming our past and our future, as well as our present. So we're kind of standing in this present moment, but our relationship to what's going to come and our relationship to what's already past can be redeemed through the victory over death that's granted to us in Christ. And so for these 3 sessions, 1 tonight and 2 tomorrow, I'm going to kind of focus on each of these traditional 3 elements of time: the past, the present, and the future, and talk about what it means to redeem time with regard to each of those. Tonight I'm going to focus on the present because that's where we are. And I think that that's really our kind of home base. This is the present moment is kind of the only area of time where we can really act and have communion with Christ. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways our experience of the present moment can become infected with sin, and how we can work a bit towards redeeming the time we're given in the present, particularly kind of mindful of Great Lent, which we find ourselves in right now. Tomorrow morning, I'll talk about the future, and then the second session tomorrow, I'll talk about redeeming time in the past. So the guiding questions that I have for tonight's session is, first of all, what is despondency? What is this spiritual sickness that I've just written a book about? And how does it relate to the present moment? And finally, how can we address despondency to deepen our communion with Christ in the present moment? So the first question, what is despondency? Now on this slide, I like to use visual images in my slides. I think it gives people sort of an idea, just kind of something to trigger the imagination. And here I have a picture of, you kind of see at the bottom of the picture a man's legs, like hairy legs, like he's been walking around barefoot, crossed in front of him, like he's laying back or reclining. And in front of him, there's this big desert. There's a sun in the distance, sort of shining straight into the camera. And you see in the desert all kinds of footprints, like someone's been walking back and forth. So the man's relaxing, but there's also a sense of some restlessness going on. He's been wandering. So you have the sense it took him a while to get to this point of rest. And you wonder, is he resting? Or has he just exhausted himself by being so restless that now he's just gonna lay there until he recovers? So just kind of keep that picture in your mind. I think after a while you'll realize why I chose that picture to represent despondency. So before we get into despondency and the present moment, I want to give some context. This spiritual sickness, which as you'll see affects our relationship to the present moment, was first written about by a desert monk named Evagrius Ponticus in the 4th century. Who's heard of Evagrius before? A few of us. Who's heard of Evagrius before reading anything by me? Okay, same. Okay, so I haven't really expanded the name of Evagrius. Evagrius is one of my favorite theologians of our tradition. Evagrius is nicknamed, sometimes you hear him nicknamed this, the father of psychotherapy. And we're not talking about modern psychotherapy, we're talking about Christian psychotherapy, or the care of the soul. He had ties to St. Basil, who I believe ordained him as a deacon, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Melania, who counseled him through what seems to have been some kind of nervous breakdown that he had during his life. And he also had ties to St. John Cassian, whom he taught. So St. John Cassian was one of his students. Evagrius was active in places like Jerusalem and Constantinople, but eventually he resided in the desert as a desert monastic. He started in the Nitrian desert of Egypt, and he found that too crowded. So he retreated even deeper into the desert to a place called Kelia, which means the cells, and it was a very famous center of monasticism, and it was a bit more solitary. I think that he would kind of spend most of the week by himself, and the brothers at Kelia would gather about once a week to share time together. Now, Evagrius is really famous for a few reasons. One, he got in trouble because he sort of dabbled in Origenism. If you know anything about church history and theology, that was a bit problematic. Certainly in his day it was problematic. Now scholars are kind of rethinking, Origenism in general. But a lot of his writings were destroyed. Specifically his more theologically heavy writings were destroyed. So we don't have as full of a source base to understand kind of his deeper theological beliefs. But he had this other interest, and that was what we might call today pastoral theology or practical theology. He was very famous for that. What Evagrius would do is he would observe the way his brother monks lived, and he would observe the way he himself lived, and kind of observe how different thoughts and temptations would enter his mind, and how they would behave, and what kinds of prayers they would respond to, what made certain temptations better, what made certain temptations worse, what types of temptations seemed to follow after other temptations, and what type of situations tended to invite spiritual struggles, that kind of thing. And he wrote about this a lot. And when you read some of his writings, it's almost like reading a psychology textbook. He was just so keen of an observer about, how human cognition works, and what kinds of processes people go through in the spiritual life, just on a mental level. That's why I say he's often nicknamed the father of psychotherapy. Interestingly, I've read articles that suggest Evagrius might have had obsessive compulsive disorder, and that might have been, these thoughts that he's writing about might have been like his form of obsessive compulsiveness. But the reality is that whether he actually had mental illness or not, his ability to just pay such close attention to these thoughts has really led to this whole kind of stream of thought within the Eastern Christian tradition about sort of how to face spiritual struggles and how to really wrestle in a meaningful and positive way against our worst thought patterns. And in writing about all of these thoughts, he kind of categorized them into specific categories of sin and destructive thoughts, and those were called the 8 deadly thoughts. So this was basically 8 passions that are at the root of all, sins, I guess. The word thought here, the Greek word for thoughts, is logismi, and in Orthodoxy, as you may already know, sin is kind of this spectrum. Sin is not, well, I just did this thing. Out of nowhere, I made this action or something, and that's a sin. First of all, sin is kind of an overarching brokenness or sickness. And when it comes to sort of specific sins in our lives, specific patterns, they always start somewhere. They start as a thought that is usually pretty neutral. So if I am in the grocery store and I'm standing in line, and of course, I'm in a hurry, and the person ahead of me insists on paying in pennies, okay? And I notice this. Just that act of noticing is not a sin. I notice, wow, they're paying with pennies. It's going to make me late for whatever I supposedly have to do. So that's a thought. Now, if I continue in that direction, which I very often do, this is not a hypothetical, this happens to me, when I'm in the grocery store. If I continue in that thought and I start to get prideful or angry at this person whom I've never met, no idea why they're paying with pennies, maybe it's all they have, then I might start thinking harsh thoughts about them, okay? And eventually, maybe I'm going to give them a mean look, or I'm going to turn my back on them, or I'm going to be cursing them in my head, or something like that. That's where we start to, you see this kind of progression start to lead you into sin. And so when these thoughts come up, these logismi, you have this choice to cooperate with that thought. And if it's a thought that's going to take you in a negative way, that's going to take you towards sin. Or you have the thought to or you have the choice to turn towards Christ, to turn away from that thought. However you do that, whether it's through the Jesus prayer, whether it's just distracting yourself, whatever. And so if on the other hand we do cooperate with this thought, and then we sin, we kind of act out in this sin. Okay, so now we're in the realm of, well, we've just committed this sin. Now, if we keep committing that sin, let's say every time we go to the grocery store, and every time there's somebody ahead of us, we're going to be more and more prone to be impatient. And pretty soon that becomes a pattern in us. And that becomes kind of a passion. So then we could say at that point that one of our passions is maybe impatience. It's not one of the 8 up here, but let's just say, okay, I struggle with impatience, which I do, true story. As soon as that kind of starts to become a pattern, it becomes even more difficult to turn away from. So this moment when these thoughts come up in the beginning is almost a sacred moment, because it's kind of our signal. Like, look out, this whole world of sin is something we're inviting every time we cooperate with these thoughts. Okay, so that's just kind of a bit of context of how, when we say sin or when we say thoughts, this is what we mean, these initial intrusive thoughts. And Evagrius believed that there were 8 patterns or categories of these thoughts: gluttony, lust, avarice, which we don't use that word a lot, but it means greed, specifically in a sort of greed about money, sadness, anger, despondency, which I'll talk more about, vainglory, which vainglory is another word we don't use a lot anymore, but it's a kind of selfish ambition. And finally, pride. Now, these thoughts these kind of categories may sound familiar to you because they sound a lot like the 7 deadly sins, which is probably a bit more popular in our culture, in our Western culture. Actually, Evagrius' 8 deadly thoughts came first before the 7 deadly sins. And his student, Evagrius' student, John Cassian, brought them to other parts of Europe. And under Pope Gregory I in the 6th century, Gregory I took these 8 evil thoughts and consolidated them into 7 by, first of all, combining sadness and despondency into sloth. He also combined vainglory and pride, so that brought the number down to 6. And then he added one more. Does anybody know what he added? He added envy. And that became the 7 deadly sins. But really, there's no probably the number of sins are limitless. The beauty of things like this, like the 8 deadly thoughts, is they give us a way to start recognizing patterns. So maybe not everything fits perfectly into a category, but it helps us start to, kind of gives us a map when we're faced with temptations. Oh, that's pride, or oh, that's sadness. So let's focus in on despondency, which is going to kind of start leading us back to this whole topic of the present moment. What is despondency? Here I have a slide, and on the picture is I believe this is a mosaic from a church in Italy. I'm not sure which one, but it says acedia with a picture of like a turtle above that. Acedia is the Latin word for the Greek word that I'm talking about. And there's a turtle on it because despondency slows us down. It turns us, kind of makes us very susceptible to fatigue. The concept here, the Greek word from which this concept despondency comes from, is called akitheia. Akitheia. And there's 2 parts of this word. First, you have which means a lack of or an absence of. Second, you have kitheia, which means care. And interestingly, the modern Greek word, this word akitheia, it's not a word like modern Greeks would recognize unless they have read a lot of 4th century, desert monastic texts, but it's not used a lot anymore. But when I'm talking to Greeks, they always say, oh, kitheia. Does anyone know what kitheia means? No. Kitheia in Greek, like modern Greek. What? It means funeral, actually. It's spelled differently. It's spelled a little bit differently, and I don't know if these roots are both coming from the same place, but suffice it to say, it's similar enough that when people hear it, they're like funeral. And it's interesting because if you think of funeral, it's a kind of care. It's a care for the body of the departed. So basically, means a lack of, kitheia means care, and so when you put that together, despondency is a lack of care or an apathy. But it's a deep apathy. It's like an existential apathy. It's alternatively described as a slackness or atonia of the soul. And atonia is actually still used in medical contexts today. It means a lack of tone. So if you have a condition or something where your muscles are atrophying, a nurse or something might use the technical term atonia or a lack of tone to describe that. Well, despondency is a lack of tone in our souls. If you imagine your soul like a belt, or like your core, core abdominal muscles, when those lose tone, like it's hard to stand up straight. Well, when our soul loses its tone, when our soul loses its focus, things start to fall through. We're not able to really hold ourselves up with the same vigor or care that we used to. What are the external symptoms of despondency? How could you maybe recognize this? Well, it kind of has 2 faces. I've already said before that it slows you down. That's why you have the picture of the turtle here. So one side of despondency is like the slow side. Evagrius often mentioned monks sort of just sleeping through the day, or just kind of moving around really slowly. Being inattentive to prayer. So you go to do your evening prayers and you can't, maybe you sort of mumble the prayers instead of speaking them clearly. Maybe you just don't even bother altogether and you just go to sleep. But there's another side of despondency, and that's more of a fast side. Despondency can also make you very restless, walking back and forth, leaving your cell as a monk to walk across the desert and visit another monk. During a time when you're supposed to be praying or spending time in solitude, you leave your cell and go bother other people, distract them. It can make your mind sort of so scattered that you have trouble reading or focusing or sitting down to do manual labor. So these are kind of the 2 sides to despondency. But I told you that Evagrius spent a lot of time trying to figure out where these thought patterns come from and how they, for him, thoughts didn't just come out of nowhere. He was always interested in figuring out, like, what causes this? And there were all these relationships between the different passions, like anger and pride. And so he would ask, well, where does this despondency come from? And according to him, the precursors are anger and desire. So on the one hand, anger at what you have. So, anger at this cell you're standing in, lonely, dark, damp, whatever. And a desire for what you don't have. I wish I had my brother monk here so I could socialize. I wish I had a fancier cell. I wish I didn't have to do this manual labor. I wish I didn't have to cook for myself, whatever. And this anger and desire, they kind of cancel each other out, because you can't, if you think about these things, it just fuels dissatisfaction, and eventually it becomes paralyzing, because you get to this point where you realize you really can't do anything about this cell. Okay? And I keep coming back to the cell idea because Evagrius was writing for monks. And I think a lot of what he says translates to us in the world, but it's interesting to think about his monastic example, because it gives us kind of a new lens even to think about, like, our own lives. Like, what is your cell? Where is the place that you've committed to live in, figuratively and literally, that you feel stuck in, or feel dissatisfied with, feel angry with? What are the things you desire to put in your cell? Those kinds of things. And when we're compelled by anger and desire at the same time, we become paralyzed, right? But my question is, as I was reading Evagrius, as I was doing the research for my book, like, what comes before the anger and desire? Because I know for myself, not even anger and desire come out of nowhere. There's always something that comes before it. And here I kind of borrowed from a writer named Kathleen Norris, who is, New York Times bestseller. She's Catholic, but she also has written about this same spiritual concept. And one of the things she points out is that really what comes first in all of this is pain. And not pain like I stubbed my toe, but pain like, my God, I'm alive and I'm going to die someday. So what's the point? Pain like, as a human being, there's so much in my life I can't control. There's so much in my life I can't get for myself, even if I want to. There's so much in my life I can't change. I can't change other people. I can't change my circumstances. I can't change the body I'm given. So much in our lives that we can't change. And also this is the pain of maybe caring, but being wounded while we are, maybe we have had times in our lives where we really do care about life, and we really do care about people around us, and we do care about fighting the good fight of faith. But for whatever reason, it kind of blew up in our faces, and now we're sort of stuck with this disillusionment, or this like scar, and maybe we don't try as hard as we used to, or we don't care as much as we used to, because we're too afraid of being hurt again or facing that disillusionment. So I've tried to illustrate this with a sort of, I don't know what you call this, a flow chart, like circular flow chart. And at the top I have pain, because I said that kind of comes first. I said these are kind of like paraphrase quotes from my book. We cease caring once the act of caring wounds us or becomes too heavy a burden to bear. And from pain we sort of cycle into anger and desire, because if you've ever lived with pain, it's not a comfortable place to be very long, so you try to cover it up. And we cover it up with all sorts of things, but in the case of despondency, we cover it up with anger and desire, because it's a lot easier to be angry and jealous and whatever than it is to be really deeply in pain. So to cover up this pain, we may escape into anger or desire. Anger toward what we have, desire for what we do not have. From the anger and desire, then, we cycle down into true despondency, which is a lack of care. So this pain, this anger, desire, these are like precursors that lead us into despondency. And this sort of apathy becomes a way to cope with the conflicting anger and desire. And, the longer we kind of live in this lack of care, it starts to become obvious, maybe in these signs and symptoms. I wrote that the void left by apathy attracts distraction, restlessness, rumination, anxiety, fear, and lethargy. And these are all, I'm sort of drawing and extrapolating off from Evagrius, that these are some of the symptoms that he mentions. And these symptoms, in and of themselves, become a new source of pain, right? If you're, let's say, ruminating, is the verb originally comes from a cow when they chew their cud, and it comes back up, and then they swallow it back down, and they digest their cud, and it keeps coming back and going, until it's fully digested. We do the same thing with our thoughts. We find things, we fixate on things we don't like, and we just go around and around and around in our heads about it. That's rumination, okay? So this is a symptom of despondency, which was originally caused by pain, but this just ruminating causes us pain, right? So that becomes a new source of pain, and puts us right back where we started, and it just is a loop. Now, usually at this point in my, discussion about despondency, people are wondering, gosh, that sounds a lot like depression. And it does sound a lot like depression. The only problem is that, depression is a term, it's a medical concept that comes out of, 20th century medical paradigm. And that's a very different paradigm than the concept of despondency. So I think that despondency and depression have a lot in common. This is kind of a Venn diagram. And if you imagine, in the middle of a Venn diagram, there's things that they have in common. They have a lot of symptoms in common. But they're also sort of coming from two slightly different places. Despondency, of course, is coming from a monastic paradigm that saw the human soul as the center of a person. And so sickness begins in the soul, and so does healing. Healing starts when we begin to pray, when we begin to turn towards Christ, when we begin to repent, really, and start forgiving people and living out of that forgiveness rather than living out of our dissatisfaction and our desire. Depression comes out of a medical paradigm that sees the body, the human body, as the center of the person. And the body is where sickness begins, and the body is where healing begins. So depression is often thought of as, weakened mood regulators in the brain, which is part of your body. And that's how, kind of the first line of medical treatment often will be medication. And then maybe increasingly, more psychotherapy and other means of treatment. So my point isn't that, one of the depression is wrong and despondency is right. My point is that these are just two sort of interlocked and intertwined ways of maybe describing kind of this deep inner sickness that I would say most human beings struggle with on some level. And so, if you're someone with depression, or someone who's depressed, and you're hearing about despondency and you're thinking, oh, this is really helpful, or I may want to read more about this, I'd say that's great. And it is very helpful to realize that people all the way back in the 4th century, Christians in the 4th century, were struggling with some of this stuff, and they were saying some really insightful things about it. But, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because medicine has also given us some really deep insights into how to treat this kind of condition. So I always say pull both together. God's given us both. God's allowed us to live in a time when we have both. So pray and read about despondency, but also do what you need to do for your depression. So the next part of my talk, I want to kind of bring us back to this topic of the present moment. How does despondency relate to time? I would say that when you kind of read the literature about despondency, kind of read where Evagrius was coming from, and just take a step back, what you end up seeing is that the epitome of despondency is that it represents an antagonistic relationship to the present moment. So remember back to that monk who's in his cell. it's too damp. He's angry at his cell. He's angry at what God has given him. Well, that is his present moment. That's his present circumstance. And it's out of that sort of, he just can't deal with being in that space and in that time. And so he kind of, when you think about desire is often future-oriented. You kind of leave your present circumstances in your mind and start fantasizing about what you could have if only, you could find a new cave, if only you could find a new job, if only you could find a new house, right? So your mind kind of jumps to the present because it doesn't want to sit still. It jumps to the future because it doesn't want to sit still in the present. What's interesting about despondency is that of all of these 8 passions that I shared earlier, it's the only one that's associated with a particular time of day. So this passion is often nicknamed the noonday demon, and you find references to the noonday demon in the Psalms. But Evagrius said, which by the way, there's some evidence, it comes from Psalm, I didn't put it in my notes. It's the Psalm where it says, 91, the sun shall not smite you by day, deadly arrows shall not fall on you. I'm really bad at memorizing scripture, but there's a part in there that says that the noonday demon will not, you will not be afflicted by the noonday demon. And there's like mixed evidence that this, when you look at like the Greek and the Septuagint, and then you go back to the Hebrew word, that word for the noonday demon was actually like an ancient deity, a Mesopotamian deity that hid in the shade and drew strength from the sun at noonday, and so it would kind of attack. That's why it would attack during this time. So it's interesting to think of basically in that psalm, it's proclaiming that the one God is sort of sovereign over all of these attacks of these different deities that would attack at different times of day. So, God is sort of sovereign over all of time throughout the day. Anyway, just that was a side note. But Evagrius kind of piggybacks on that concept, and he nicknames this condition the noonday demon, and he believed that it attacked between the hours of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And if who's ever been to Greece or spent time in a desert, that is just a horrendous time of the day. And I live in Canada, so not that much further north than here, but you know what I'm talking about. It just doesn't, at least in Toronto, it never really gets very hot. Not even in the summer. We have hot days, but they're nothing compared to hot days in other parts of the world. And when I was writing Time and Despondency, and I'm writing about this, I'm thinking, how can I, surely Evagrius didn't literally mean it only attacks at the noonday. Maybe he just meant, symbolically, because it's during that time the sun sort of appears to stand still, and you feel like time is standing still. So I kind of went with that, and I viewed this whole noonday concept in symbolic terms. And then I went to Greece, and I had been to Greece before. I had been to Croatia and other areas where it gets truly, truly hot. But I happened to go back to Greece shortly after submitting my manuscript. And it was in August, I think, which is the worst time to go to Greece. But I'm outside in the middle of the day, and I just wanted to die. It's so hot, and it's so bright, and I realized, no, I think Evagrius really, literally believed that there's something about this time of day in those climates, and he was in Egypt, which is even hotter, that is really, really difficult to keep about you a sense of spiritual vigilance and hope, and just keep your wits about you. So anyway, it's the only passion that's associated with the time of day, which is very interesting. But of course, it can attack any time of day. The boredom and restlessness and apathy of despondency tempt us from the needs of the here and now. So some of the things that Evagrius mentions that the monks would be tempted away from are prayer and psalmody, particularly at night. Reading. He gives an example that, the despondent monk would try to read a book, and he would flip a few pages and try and read and get bored, so he'd try and flip ahead even further in the book, try and read again, would get bored, and finally he would just close the book and go to sleep. Another thing that the monks would be tempted away from is manual labor that needed to get done for their bodily needs, or for the needs of their monastic community. A lot of times they would make things to sell in urban areas to sort of sustain themselves or be able to provide food for the guests that they would have, things like that. And as despondency entices us away from the things that need to get done, from the things that our present circumstances consist of, it tempts us toward things that are unnecessary, but usually easier or more pleasurable. So I've already used the example of socializing and distracting others, particularly during times where maybe you don't need or shouldn't be socializing with people. In excessive sleep and excessive eating. And this isn't the excessive eating of gluttony. Gluttony is kind of a lust for food. Despondency is like, you're so dead inside you don't even have an appetite or like a passion for food. You're just eating out of sheer boredom. You just don't care anymore, so what better to do but eat? And then finally, just towards a way of life of doing nothing, just kind of sitting in boredom. I have a little quote here from Evagrius, and I'll read it. This is from one of his practical treatises. He wrote, "The demon of acedia, or despondency, also called the noonday demon, is the one that causes the most serious trouble of all. First of all, he makes it seem that the sun barely moves, if at all, and that the day is 50 hours long. Then he constrains the monk to look constantly out the windows, to walk outside the cell, to gaze carefully at the sun to determine how far it stands from the 9th hour, to look this way, and now that. Then, too, he instills in the heart of the monk a hatred for the place, a hatred for his very life itself, a hatred for manual labor." So in despondency, we feel that time is standing still, that the present circumstances we've been given, which we hate, are never going to end. And out of that, we get this kind of like restless energy where we can't stop moving, we can't stop, seeking distractions, anything to get our mind off this sort of incessant, dead time in which we find ourselves. Oops. Now this is from Evagrius' student, John Cassian, who said something similar. St. John wrote, he being the despondent monk, he looks about anxiously this way and that, and sighs that none of the brethren come to see him, and often goes in and out of his cell, and frequently gazes up at the sun as if it was too slow in setting. And so a kind of unreasonable confusion of mind takes possession of him, like some foul darkness. So that's just kind of a, very similar, slightly differently worded description of despondency. So as I see it, despondency is kind of a gateway passion. You think of like gateway drugs. Marijuana is a gateway drug because it, once you start taking it, you're like more tempted to do other things. Well, despondency is kind of a gateway passion because once you're afflicted by it, your soul becomes so like drained, I said this like slackness, that it sort of lets anything inside. And I think one of the ways it does this is it, in sort of this hatred we develop for our cell, which is I see as a symbol of our present circumstances, we are tempted, our minds are tempted to escape into the future and to the past. So on the slide, I have someone here who's standing at a crossroads. And where he stands, just to use this as like a little visual exercise here, where he's standing, imagine that's the present moment, okay? And I think ideally, in life, I wanted to find a picture where there was like a three-way crossroads where he would be able to keep walking straight, and then he has these two diverging paths to the side. But I couldn't find a picture like that, so I had to make do with this one. But just imagine there's a middle path. So he's in the present moment. The present moment is in the middle. And we have to keep walking that middle path forward through each moment that God gives us. But our minds, because they feel constrained by the present moment, because they feel they can't control the present moment, want to flit off in these other directions. So your mind, through its thoughts, tries to escape to the past through things like regret, sadness, nostalgia, anger, resentment, and the forgetfulness of God's deeds. All of those spiritual struggles, they're ways of relating to the past. They're broken ways of relating to the past. So that's on the one hand. But sometimes the mind will also try to escape to the future through things like worry, anxiety, fear, fantasy, vainglory, or the selfish ambition that I mentioned earlier, avarice or greed, and finally, hopelessness. So if you think of all of those spiritual struggles, they are all ways of relating to the future, sort of in this broken way, this kind of way of relating to the future that is essentially forgetful of Christ and forgetful of what God has given us in the present. So again, just to kind of sum up, despondency represents a spiritual antagonism toward the present moment. It entices us away from our present circumstances, which is, the thing that's significant about our present circumstances is this is what God has given us. Whether we like it or not, whether our present circumstances are maybe the result of mistakes we've made or not, this is where we are, and it's the only place we can be. And it's really the only place in time that's real in any sense. We can't relate to God through our memories. Our memories are great, and I have some great memories of times when I felt close to God or whatever. But remembering those times is not the same as communing with Christ in the present. It's just my own sort of nostalgia or fantasy of times that I had with God in the past. And my whole argument is that to have fellowship with Christ and heal from the sickness of despondency, we have to recover our care for the present moment. So I want to kind of turn towards the present moment by turning towards Christ. I have here an icon. What is this icon of, if you can tell? Sorry? The Garden of Gethsemane. Yes, we're going to be visiting this place with Christ in just a few weeks during Holy Week. This is a garden. The Garden of Gethsemane is at a particular point in time when Christ has asked his disciples to stand watch with him and to pray. And they have fallen asleep, as you can see here at the bottom of the icon. They're all sleeping. And Christ is praying to the Father, and this is the point in time where he says, remove the cup of sorrow from me, but if it be your will, let it remain. So he is in this very excruciating moment. Possibly, the hardest moment any human being has ever been in. Of course, with the exception to the time that he would spend on the cross, which was incredibly painful as well. But the reason I think that this moment was the most painful is because it was that moment of ascent where it becomes clear that Christ is voluntarily. This is kind of the moment when we as humans are given a glimpse into the voluntary taking on of his suffering that Christ did for us. So the crucifixion wasn't just, a top-down, like, God the Father, no, you must take this cup. It was in this prayer you see kind of the unity that exists between the Father and the Son and their sort of united will. But anyway, think about this moment as a present, as an icon of what the present moment is. Because we all have present moments where we don't want to face whatever it is that's going on, okay? And we sort of have two choices. We can either distract ourselves and sleep it off and just basically turn our backs and sleep it off and hope that it passes, hope that when we wake up it's going to be over. Which, side note, I'm really big on sleep. So I used to hear, when I would hear the narrative of the Garden of Gethsemane, and, Christ is saying, will you please pray with me? Will you please stay up and stay watch with me? And they fall asleep, and Christ is kind of angry or voicing his frustration, or more like disappointment, I think. I'm thinking, it's late. Like, let them sleep. It's late. They're going to need their energy for the next day, because the next day is going to be pretty bad. I mean, as my human nature, I'm like, just it's torturous to have to stay up late. But that is an icon of our human nature, because we're tempted to fall asleep, whether physically or just mentally kind of shut down in the present when we don't want to face it. Or on the other hand, we can turn to God and acknowledge the suffering, the boredom, the apparent meaninglessness, because I don't think any moment in time is ever truly meaningless, but sometimes it really seems meaningless. So we can turn to God and acknowledge what seems to be meaningless or senseless. And we can say, nevertheless, thy will be done. And be alive to that present moment that we're given. So I think that this is a really, beautiful encapsulation of the choice that we're given, not just in the really difficult times, but literally every single moment that we're given in our lives. Okay, so let's say you want to turn towards God. Let's say you don't want to be the sleeping disciples in the time that you're given. How do you begin to step back into the arena of the present moment? Well, luckily, in monastic literature and works of other, thinkers and theologians all across our tradition, there's many practical antidotes to despondency. And some of these antidotes are the very things we are tempted to hate or scorn in despondency. So one of them is that Evagrius talks a lot about is manual labor. There was we have this image of the desert fathers a lot of times weaving baskets, and one of the reasons they did that is because it gave them something to do with their hands to kind of stop being as captive to the oppressive thoughts of their mind. So things like, just quotidian or daily tasks like doing the laundry, doing dishes, sweeping the floor, caring for children, these become sort of our path back to the present moment, even though they're also often the things we're trying to escape, right? But when we can kind of go to these tasks with a new awareness and a thanksgiving, they become times when we can really begin to be alive again and become ourselves again. And if you really struggle with those things, one of the things that Evagrius points out is like every time you sit down to do a task, make it small enough that you can actually finish it in a short period of time. So if you have a huge mountain of laundry to do, just take one small basket of that and go into a different room and say, I'm going to fold this laundry, in the next 20 minutes or whatever. And that's it. Evagrius is very big on, sit down to do a task and then finish it and go on do something else. And the more we do that, but in those 20 minutes, be aware, be thankful, maybe say the Jesus prayer, whatever your time frame is to finish that task, really try to be alive during that time. And then when it's done, and you sort of go about your day. Another thing that Evagrius talks a lot about is moderation and balance. So never, again, going back to the laundry analogy, don't do the mountain of laundry, do the one basket. And in prayer, when you're starting to feel despondent and let's say you haven't done your prayer rule for so long, maybe that's not the time to attend an all-night vigil or try to have an all-night vigil by yourself in your home. That's just overwhelming. So you have to start somewhere small and moderate with something that's within your actual capacity, and you can talk to a priest about that. But he's a very big fan of never going outside of your capacity. And same thing with fasting. Something that's interesting about Evagrius is he had a lot of digestive issues. We know that, and there's reports about him from people that were alive during his time and tried to write his biography, that Evagrius went way over the top fasting. And seen as though the people writing that were fellow desert monks, who themselves were probably barely eating, he was probably like going overboard. And in going overboard, he actually destroyed part of his digestive system and had a lot of difficulties later in life, and would be told by people like St. Anthony to just moderate. Moderate. And so when you read Evagrius's work, he's often saying things like, don't fast too hard if it's going to be too hard on your body and stuff. And that's because he himself learned that the hard way. And the final thing, really the mother of all virtue is thanksgiving. If you're struggling with pretty much anything in life, Thanksgiving is going to help. And I like the term thanksgiving rather than gratitude, because not that I think that, gratitude is a bad word, but we, in the Bible, we're never commanded to be thankful or to have gratitude. We're always commanded to give thanks. Giving thanks is an action. It's something we do, whether speaking it aloud or just praying it within our hearts. And we are always giving thanks to someone else, usually God. We can also give thanks to people. And we're giving thanks for something that God has given us or that someone else has done for us. And so thinking of, thanksgiving to God for something, this is like a relational triangle here. And it forces us to stay in relationship with God. Whereas if I just say, oh, I'm grateful, that's very interior, and it can, if I'm not careful, it can become just a very individual thing. And also, I think giving thanks is a bit easier than being thankful, because you can give thanks, and you should give thanks, even if you don't feel thankful. Because we're not commanded to feel thankful, although hopefully we do move in that direction. But when you are having trouble getting there, it's sort of less pressure to know you can just give thanks, and you should be giving thanks no matter what. Okay, so all of these are just three of very many practical antidotes. In my book, in chapter 7, I have a whole slew of practical things you can do in your life to try to counter despondency. But all of these practical things require turning toward rather than avoiding Christ and the present moment he's placed before us. The present is the only time in which we can have fellowship with Christ. There's a lot of talk in our culture today about, be present, be in the present moment. Well, I don't know what people mean by that if they don't have Christ. Because as good as it sounds, the whole reason the present moment is special, and I think as human beings, we see that about the present moment. I can't define this moment in time that we're sharing. I can't say how long it lasts. I can't hold it in my hands. And as soon as I say something, it's over. The words are out of my mouth, and it's all in the past. But what I can say is that there's something special about it. We have a point of contact here that is only true right now. And in the past, we'll look back on this time. We'll never, ever again be in this time. And the whole reason it has that texture is because of Christ. Because in becoming incarnate, which, there's this verse in Revelations that talks about the Lamb who was slain before the foundations of the world. The whole world, it's not that the world existed and then Christ came in a certain point in time. The whole world is predicated and formed around the fact that Christ, that the Son of God, became incarnate. And this present moment is filled with him. So it's not that Christ just happens to be in the present moment. The present moment is the way it is because Christ is. and he is with us, and he is everywhere. We say that God is everywhere present, filling all things. It's very philosophical, but just, if you think more about that, it'll like completely change your relationship to your circumstances. So I want to kind of, in conclusion, just wrap our way back to the topic of Lent, because I think that Lent, is a time when we are trying to think more about how it is we relate to God, how it is we relate to our neighbor. And I have a question, is despondency strictly a monastic ailment? Because people like Evagrius and his contemporaries were only writing about monks. Okay, so does that mean that people outside of a monastery don't struggle with despondency? Sure hope not, because then I don't know what I have. Then something else besides despondency. But I would argue it's not just a monastic ailment, but it is an ascetical ailment. What do I mean by that? Well, ascesis, from which our word ascetical comes from, is like the training. It's almost an athletic training. And in the spiritual life, our spiritual life, which is all of life, is kind of a like athletic training for the soul. And I don't think you can have despondency if you're not engaged even just a little bit in ascesis. Now you might say, well, I'm not really engaged, but I feel despondent. But I'm guessing, deep down inside of you, you believe that it's important in life to try. Even if you don't always feel like you can try or you can care. Deep down, you want improvement in life. You never want to be standing still. You don't like the feeling of standing still. And I think deep down that most of us have that feeling at our core, that it's not good to stand still. And that is really the seed of ascesis, the paradigm or the worldview that it's worth it to keep moving, to keep trying, to keep caring. Again, even if we're in a time when we don't have the energy for any of that. Now, on the other hand, there are other like philosophical schools of thought that really don't care. If you think of the Epicureans, the ancient Epicureans, their motto, well, the motto that's often sort of projected onto them is eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. So if I'm like not doing anything worthwhile in life, but I'm just eating and drinking, and I don't care about God, I don't care about this, like they would say that's fine. It really is fine, and actually that's the end. That's the goal in life, is to just not care and sort of not live with any consequences. But I think most of us, we do feel at our core that there's something worth living for and there's something worth dying for, even if we can't always summon ourselves to battle. So despondency needs that inner human desire to afflict us. If we're the Epicureans, despondency has nothing to hang on to. Oh, you're just eating and drinking all the time because you're going to die tomorrow? Okay, fine, I can't. You're already living the lifestyle. Despondency can't really hang on to that. Now, what's interesting about Lent is that it is kind of we step up our sort of ascetical pursuits in the spiritual life. It's a school of repentance. Father Alexander Schmemann says it's a school of repentance, but it's a school of a lot of things. It's a school of fasting. It's a school of almsgiving. It's a school of going to church more regularly. It's a school of sitting through really long services that through which our minds often wander or get bored or we become restless. It's a school of all of those things, and it brings us, all of these schools are supposed to bring us back to Christ and bring us back to prayer, to relating to Christ. So as an ascetical journey, Lent both reveals our despondent tendencies. We're sitting in the pre-sanctified liturgy or the canon of St. Andrew, and we become bored. So it's revealing something of despondency within us. But it's also providing the means of healing that despondency, because then in that long service, to use the example, we have these continuous moments to come back to. Your mind wanders away. You're thinking about how bored you are. And then the next line of the canon comes, and you have this immediate gift, this immediate signal that it's never too late to come back to the present moment that you're given. So I want to end with two questions. One is, what is your cell this Lent? So, there's just one question here. What is your cell this Lent, or cells? And what I mean by this, I had kind of used a number of times this example of the monastic cell. And so just to spell out that symbol or metaphor once again, a cell is a place that you have taken a vow, whether in words or in your spirit, or God has asked you to be in this Lent. Your cell may be your job. Your cell may be your life with your kids, your relationship with your kids, pets you have to take care of. It may be your marriage. It may be a friendship or caregiving for a parent. Cells are places we have a responsibility to be in, but maybe we don't always like being there, or we feel confined, or we don't like how it looks, or we wish it could be different. That's our cell. So think of some of the cells you're in. Maybe one of your cells is, church. Maybe you find it difficult. Maybe you find Lent difficult in the church because coming to church makes you bored, or it draws up doubts you have, or what have you. All of these are cells. And I want you to just kind of think of one of those cells, kind of imagine yourself, you can even close your eyes, imagine yourself standing, what is it like to really stand in that situation? And I'm going to read you a quotation from Evagrius. It's a longer quote, but it's just kind of a thought exercise. And it's something that I sort of come back to when I myself am struggling to stay in my cell and be present with Christ. So, close your eyes. Imagine that you're in this cell that you were thinking of before. And I'm going to read this quote. Seated in your cell, gather together your mind. Give heed to the day of your death. Then look at the dying of your body. So even as you're picturing yourself in this other situation, think about the impermanence of your life, and think about all of the visible signs of death that are already at work in your body. Consider the situation that you're in. Consider your cell. Accept the suffering. Condemn the vanity that is in the world, and show no weakness in virtue and zeal, so that you can abide always in the same purpose and practicing of stillness. Call to mind also the present state of things in hell. So as you're sitting in your own cell, think about what things are like right now in hell. Consider how it is with the souls who are there, in what sort of utterly bitter silence they wait. But also call to mind the day of resurrection and presentation before God. Bring before yourself the remembrance of both these possibilities, heaven and hell, resurrection and hell. Do not detach your thinking from the recollection of these things, so that through these you may also escape defiling and harmful thoughts. You can open your eyes if you had them closed, but just to close, I think the reason that this quote is so helpful sometimes is it reminds us that in every cell, in every situation we find ourselves in, we really have two choices. On the one hand, hell, and on the one hand, resurrection. So even as we are in our situations, hell exists and the resurrection exists. And really the task of being present with Christ is allowing both of those realities to be real to us, and choosing, first of all, being aware of how serious hell is, and which is basically our turning away from God. It's not so much a punishment, but our turning away from God's love. How serious that is on the one hand, but how real the resurrection is on the other, and choosing always to side with the resurrection, even when we're faced with tempting thoughts and really difficult circumstances. So that's all for today. And like I said, tomorrow we'll